Alex Evans, thank you so much for agreeing for an interview for my book. How are you?
Pleasure. Very well, thank you.
Good. I wanted to ask you initially about the myth gap, which I've read, but not all my readers have. Could you describe it and what the central argument is?
Sure. So in a nutshell, the myth gap is about the idea that if we want to affect big change in the world, then it's not about evidence, it's not about policy proposals, it's not about data and pie charts, that really it's about stories. And that point of view is very much from my own experience, because I spent a long time as a policy wonk, working in government in the UN and so on. All through that time, I really believed that if you got the right evidence to the right policymakers, then change would result. And as I set out in the book, increasingly I realised over time that that wasn't in fact the case. And I had some disillusioning moments in the UN, for example, where I was really forced face to face with that fact, which left me wondering, well, if evidence and arguments aren't enough, then what is? What will unlock really transformative change in the world? And essentially the answer that I set out is stories, and not just any stories, but the kind of deep, grand stories that societies share about where they are, where they might be trying to get to, who they are, these kind of profound, kind of orienting stories. And historically, we've called those kinds of stories myths. Some of them are religious, some of them are about heroes and quests. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. But that, in our past, has been the role of myth. But today, we've kind of lost those shared stories. And that's partly, I think, because we have come to think that things are either literally true or they're not true at all. And so myth has not fared well in that regard. Now a myth means something that's wrong. We talk about an urban myth. It's something that's simply untrue. So that's part of it. And then also, our attention spans have become that much shorter. So we have lots happening. We have, endless social media feeds and entertainment and all the information in the world at our fingertips. But what we lack, I think, is those kind of larger, deeper stories that put it all together into an account of, what we value, where we're trying to go, who we are, as I say. So that, if you like, is the myth gap. And the problem is with the myth gap that it leaves us vulnerable to what I call anti-myths that can fill that gap. So one obvious example is the anti-myth that you are what you buy. And this is a sort of a deep story that doesn't help us, doesn't really serve us, but that is very pernicious. It's a widely held story these days. Another one, of course, is the sort of stories that you hear from leaders like Donald Trump, for example, where these are very them and us narratives in which we, in inverted commas, are threatened by some other, in inverted commas, and therefore we need to build bigger walls, or we need to take back control, or whatever it may be. And so the kind of stories, the kind of myths that I think we do need are stories that will help us to think in terms of a larger us rather than a them and us. Stories that help us to think about a longer now, so that situate us halfway between a deep past and an equally deep future, and make us think much more about the long term. And finally, stories that prompt us to think in terms of a different good life. That sense of what it is that we value, so that, for example, growth is something we think less as being about material consumption, and more perhaps about growing up as a species, about taking much more responsibility for our actions and the consequences of that. So those are the sorts of ways that I think myths, 21st century myths, if you like, could change how we think and how we act and what we view as our purpose and what we think is possible. And in terms of where those myths can come from, I think they all of us have a very creative possibility in the kinds of stories that we use to shape our own thinking, that we tell each other, and ultimately that create that sort of shared sense that I'm talking about. So that's it in a nutshell.
Fantastic, Alex. It's a great book. And at the end of the book, you describe, I think, in part, the sort of world that you envisage. Well, it's a very significantly, it's a world in which we live within planetary boundaries, in which poverty is abolished, or in which we live with dignity and in peace with one another. The book I'm trying to write is called A Restored Earth, 10 Paths to a Hopeful Future. And I wanted to ask you, what's your vision of a restored Earth? What kind of planet? And how will humanity live in the coming decades, in your mind, in your vision?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that I love the concept of restoration. It's a kind of shared interest for
Yes.
the two of us, because I must admit I've never really warmed to the language of sustainable development, because if our ambitions are only to make something sustainable, if that's as far as our ambition goes, it feels a bit like treading water, preventing things from getting any worse, just getting by. I would be much more excited by a story in which we don't just stop damaging the earth and each other, but actually we restore, we heal, we mend the damage that we've done. I think that can be a very enriching story. And when you see it in the real world, I used to live in Ethiopia, and some of the ecological restoration happening there in the north of the country, exactly where the famine happened in 84, 85, is just extraordinary to see these areas that were becoming deserts turned back into these lush, verdant valleys, and how that builds not just natural resilience, but resilience for people too. Those areas have become, even during Ethiopia's recently very serious food security crisis, much more resilient, because the water retention is there, the soil quality is there, and so the livelihoods are there. So I think restoration is a wonderful, rich concept. I also like the fact that restoration does and can talk about people as well as ecosystems. So I'm very interested in the idea of restorative justice, for example, in the criminal justice context, where offenders are brought together in a structured interaction with their victims, and the victims can talk about the impact that the crime had on them. And it's really striking how this can achieve very transformative shifts in perspective on behalf of the offender, who will often then want to find ways of making amends for what they've done. And so it becomes a restorative encounter for both sides of the table, as it were. So that's another example of why I think restoration is so rich. But I guess for me, really, and one of the ideas I talk about in the book is the idea that you can think of life as a tapestry that involves interconnected ecosystems, interconnected communities of people. It's all part of one tapestry. That tapestry can unravel if we act from ignorance, if we allow injustice to prosper, if we lack wisdom. But it can also be mended. And I think some of the myths that speak most to me personally are about exactly that, the risk of what happens if that tapestry starts to unravel, how actually we can mend it again, and what that looks like in practice, where the idea of justice together with wisdom is absolutely front and center. So that, for me, is I guess the core of what restoration is all about.
That's wonderful. You've also just written, or been involved in writing, a commission on business and the Sustainable Development Goals, and I wanted to ask for your view on what business can do to contribute to a better world, a more peaceful and more environmentally sound world.
Well, I'll give you my personal view, not the Commission's view, because I no longer work for the Commission, so I have no mandate to speak for it formally. But I think that there's a lot that's already happening that's exciting in terms of how business can make a contribution on this. And I'm thinking not about corporate social responsibility and that kind of voluntarist stuff, but much more about exciting new business models where companies reimagine what their core business actually is, in a way that delivers for sustainable development as well as bottom line performance in the financial sense. And you can start to see businesses doing that. And there's a lot of the most exciting examples are kind of startups where they're beginning with nothing built in. There's no kind of systems to change. Everything's being built from scratch, so there's tremendous creative possibility. And if you look at, a company like Impossible Foods, who are making alternatives to meat that taste just like meat, but with a fraction of the environmental impact of meat, that's incredibly exciting. And they're setting out to blend from the outset the sustainability with the financial performance. And there's lots of examples of startups like that. But in many cases, that business case for sustainability is not there. I mean, ultimately, if the business case were already completely in place, you wouldn't need a business commission for sustainable development. I mean, it would all just be happening, because if business is good at anything, it's identifying and seeking out opportunity. So there is an underlying huge issue here of market failure, of just incentives that prevent businesses from doing the sustainable thing, even when their chief executives may want very much to do it. And so one of the other things the Business Commission's report talks about is how we address those systemic market failures, and that does involve policy. I mean, there's much that needs to change in financial markets too, but for me, the bottom line here is that if you want to alter the incentives that shape how both business leaders and investors behave, then you need to make prices tell the truth about social and environmental impacts. And this is in the jargon, the whole area of pricing externalities. So an obvious example is carbon taxes that ensure that prices tell the truth about climate impacts. But increasingly, I hope we will see that in lots of other areas, like water use or waste or pollution. Because ultimately where we need to get to is, in the environmental sense, for example, a circular economy, where nothing is wasted, everything is reused. We can do that. I mean, that's absolutely within reach. But we need to get the incentives right if we want business to be the engine that really powers that. Similarly, on the kind of social side of the equation, it is well within reach to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, to have a much more inclusive and equal world than we do now. But again, that involves policy and fiscal change and regulatory reform and so on. To do that, it's not going to happen on its own. So I think one thing the report is not saying is leave it to the market because businesses have got this. There are increasingly business leaders who do get it as an idea, but it needs to be states and businesses working together.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's very clear. What do we do about those who disagree with us, those who have a completely different worldview? How do we avoid further division? How do we win over, for example, Mr. Trump to a view of the world that you and I are seeking to elucidate?
Yeah. So I think it's a really great question, and in a way the core question, given just how polarised our politics are. And of course there's the enormous risk that as we hang out with people who think like us on our social media echo chambers, that polarisation just gets worse and worse, and that we have little sort of tribes just talking to themselves. I think that this is where shared stories become so important. I mean, if you take climate change, for example, data shows that climate is now the single most polarized issue in America. What you think about climate change predicts where you are on the left-right political spectrum more accurately than what you think about gun control or abortion or capital punishment. Right. It is the single most polarized issue. And the problem with that, of course, is that climate change is much too big of an issue to be solved without commitment to solving it across society. It can't be challenged successfully if it's just a bunch of kind of progressives and liberals on one hand who are simply ignoring or outright fighting more conservative people at the other end of the political spectrum. We have to find a way that this becomes a shared problem that everyone regards as a priority. And in the myth gap, I argue that stories are the essential way to do that. And I think one of the things that excites me a lot is examples of where you've had societies at moments of quite dangerous transition that have used collective storytelling, collective processes of imagining the future together as a way of building that kind of shared awareness. And the best example of that is probably in South Africa, just as apartheid was finishing and a new political settlement was being built. And there was a very famous process called the Montfleur scenarios, which brought together thought leaders and ordinary people from across South Africa. So, you know, both black and white, from business and trade unions and government and local communities and so on. And through a whole series of structured conversations came up with 4 stories about possible futures for South Africa, which you can read, and they're interesting. They're kind of short and pithy and nicely written. But really it's the process that matters more than the output. And the fact that these very disparate communities came together for this shared process of imagining and storytelling, and in the process teasing out assumptions and values about what mattered to them and so on. It's the antithesis of a kind of, of the combative, polarized politics that we see. around us so much now, because it's coming together to imagine a future. You're not arguing about today's issues, you're imagining what your children, the future that they will inhabit. So it puts you in a different mindset, and I think can, in a lot of ways, sidestep that polarization. So I think it's about process as well as the shared stories, and we need urgently to get much better at doing that.
Very clear. Closer to home, I wanted to ask you about the UK government's commitment to 0.7% of GDP to international aid, something I'm very proud about as a British citizen. But what kind of story do we need to tell to sort of shore up that commitment to our, responsibilities to others who are less fortunate?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult one because, of course, although 0.7 has been upheld, it's the target of increasingly intense criticism from things like the Daily Mail is really gunning for it at the moment. I feel that, I like the framing that you just alluded to, which is being proud of this. I think you can try to make a self-interest based argument for aid, and that's what the current government is trying to do, saying that this prevents migration and reduces conflict risk and creates trading opportunities for Britain. And that may be true up to a point. I think you could probably, some of the data there are a bit contested. But more fundamentally, I feel that framing this in terms of self-interest is less creative than when we frame it as something we can be proud of, that's about responsibility and doing the right thing, and imagining ourselves as part of a larger collective, as part of a larger us, a 7 billion us, not just a sort of 58 million us in the UK. And so in that regard, I think of climate change as well, where if you look at Obama's first term, he framed climate change very much as being about self-interest. Look at the damages if we do nothing, look at the green jobs we could create, and so on. And history shows that when, in his second term, he started framing it as being about responsibility and future generations, a moral agenda that's really about this is the right thing to do, that had much more resonance and much more traction, actually, in driving policy. So I feel that on 0.7 and on making the case for aid and for commitment to international development, we're strongest when we lead with values rather than self-interest. So that I think is the approach that I would go for.
Thank you very much, Alex. I also wanted to ask you about the biodiversity, the sense of our responsibilities to other species, in a sense. You and I think, work predominantly on humanitarian and development issues. We then moved into climate change and have done a lot on climate over the last decade, or perhaps 2 decades in your case. But what about biodiversity and nature and conservation? And what sort of stories do we need to tell about that?
Well, I think for me that goes back to the analogy of a tapestry in which ecosystems and people are both part of the same tapestry. It's when I was an undergrad, did environmental political philosophy as one of my kind of specialist areas, and there's this endless debate that goes back and forth about whether you're ecocentric or anthropocentric, i.e., are you more concerned with ecosystems, or do you think humans are kind of preeminent and should have a privileged position? And I always felt this was just a false dichotomy, as if humans could exist independently of ecosystems. There's fundamentally a convergence of interests there. I mean, this is interdependence as tangible as you can possibly get. So, and again, it's, you can try and make a self-interest based argument for caring about biodiversity, and people have been doing a lot of that in recent years. And Ed, of course, the big study called The Economics of Biodiversity, which sets out to value the ecosystem services that we get from having biodiversity. And that's useful, that's great. But again, I think, it seems almost bizarre to lead with a dollar value on biodiversity when there's the much more fundamental reality that, we're all just part of this tapestry. Of course we are. How could it be otherwise? And it just seems very strange and convoluted not to start from there. So again, I think, as we were just talking about, this is first and foremost about values and identity, much more than kind of economic self-interest. So for me, that's why biodiversity matters. I mind about biodiversity because it's part of me and I'm part of it. We're all part of this tapestry that we call, creation, or whatever language we might choose. And so, if we hurt species diversity, if we lose species at the rate that we're doing now, we're hurting ourselves. This is a part of us that we're losing.
What's the best case scenario in your view, Alex, for where we are today, to the sort of vision that we have vis-a-vis the humanitarian crisis, poverty reduction, alleviation, better policy towards climate change? How do we get from the world we're in at the moment, in February 2017, to the world which is effectively envisioned in the SDGs by 2030?
Well, I guess at the most practical level, this is a political proposition. It will take concerted political action to do that. But then working backwards, I think the key thing we need for that to happen is for politicians to feel like there's political demand and political space for them to respond to that agenda. The polarization of our politics that we've already been talking about is a major impediment to that. So we have to attend to that. And I think that involves all sides being willing to listen deeply, to kind of tell their stories, but also to listen to those of others. I mean, so many progressive people I follow in the media, for example, or that I see on my Facebook feed, seem almost at risk of kind of demonizing the other, people who voted for Donald Trump, for example. And yet, so many people who did vote for Donald Trump or vote for Brexit did so for reasons that we ought to be able to understand and empathise with and even share. They think our politics is broken and they want it fixed. They think that our economic system is unfair and doesn't give equality of opportunity or give everyone a sort of fair shot or reward effort equitably. They feel that the banks have had a free ride since the financial crisis, these sorts of things. These are all areas that Donald Trump spoke to very effectively, very resonantly. There are also areas that progressives have been trying less successfully of late to speak to. But I think that, you know, as we've been talking about, the possibility is there to kind of imagine a future together across the political spectrum that speaks to these sorts of priority. If we can get a politics and a sense of political demand for these areas that's widely shared across society, I think that will take us to achievement of the SDGs. But I think that, you know, this is, in the first instance, not primarily about policies or about institutions and so on. That will come. But first and foremost, I think right now it's about building movements that drive change, which need to be animated by resonant stories, and it's about reaching out across political divides and building bridges rather than walls, because we're only going to do this if we do it together. That feels like the necessary foundation to anything else.
And how do we build those movements? Is it through a combination of measures, but is it of ours? Is it sort of global action? Is it local political action? Is it individual behaviour? How do we construct?
So I think all of the above, and one of the exciting things about the moment that we're in right now is that there's tremendous innovation and experimentation happening. I think that on the progressive end of the political spectrum, a huge number of people are really shocked by what happened during 2016 and the early policies of Donald Trump's administration, and that has really supercharged the level of engagement with politics, and that's great. I think that there's lots of encouraging thinking about how the kinds of movements that are emerging can be movements that reach out rather than just talking to themselves. So here in the UK, for example, you'll know there's a new movement called More United, which, as the name implies, sets out from the outset to be inclusive and to bring together people of, you know, potentially very different views and values and so on, but to start from the premise that everybody has something valuable to say and deserves to be heard, and that the possibility is there of consensus and common ground. In America, similarly, Van Jones, great organizer and activist in the Democrat Party, who I think was one of the most articulate spokespeople for, you know, just understanding what happened with the election, is building what he calls a love army, and this will be a movement that absolutely sets out to resist unjust policies in the Trump administration, but to do so in a way that's based on love and inclusion rather than division and hate. And this stuff matters. It's not woolly. It's not kind of airy-fairy. This is the necessary design principles for a movement that can be inclusive and that can grow to include people who might start from very different places. That sense of being built on a chassis of kind of love and respect and listening is the first step, as I say. So I think there's a lot of encouraging stuff happening.
And in my last question, what I wanted to know on a personal front, what drives you and how optimistic you are and what keeps you going in light of all the work that you've done and that they're doing.
So, I guess, I mean, for a long time, I've had the sense of being alive at this sort of extraordinary moment in history, a really pivotal moment for our species. I mean, I think I've, certainly since I was an undergrad, thought of this as a moment in which our species is in its adolescence, that the possibility is there for us to kind of grow up as a species. And that's exciting, but also kind of scary, of course, because adolescence is a moment at which, if you think of adolescent kids, they're very unwilling to accept any kind of limits. They're very heedless of consequences. They're very focused on instant gratification. Sounds a lot like us at the species level. And then growing up is about, recognizing consequences and thinking of more than just your own narrow self-interest and taking responsibility and so on. But one of the things that really interests me in those moments that I talk about a bit in the book is that historically, adolescence is a stage of life that's been dealt with by society through these processes called initiation, where the kind of extremism of adolescence is met with an equally focused sort of extremism from the elders of the society. I mean, initiation processes were kind of quite extreme, quite scary. Think of, kind of being sent off to go and walk about in the outback. I mean, these are very demanding change moments. And I think there's an interesting sort of analogy, if you like, about, that perhaps this is an initiatory moment for us as a species. It's extremely demanding. It's very chaotic. It's quite scary. We're not guaranteed a successful outcome here. Everything is at stake. But the possibility is there for us to make this kind of successful transition into our species' young adulthood. And that kind of makes sense to me. And I think it intuitively makes sense to lots of people. There's a writer called Dwayne Elgin who's, over the years, enjoyed asking people, if we were a species, where do you think we're at? Are we at our childhood stage, our adolescence, our adulthood, or our senescence? And very consistently, in all different cultures, 2/3, 3/4 of people say adolescence. We just kind of seem to get this intuitively. So I think that for me is a kind of another helpful myth, if you like, one that is useful in orientating where we are. I find it useful in describing both what's happening, but also, and what's demanded of us, but also where we might get to. So I think holding to those kinds of stories can be the source of a lot of hope and faith in difficult, chaotic, volatile moments, and we're clearly in one. But I have lots and lots of hope for the future because of thinking about it in that kind of way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much,
Not at all.
Alex. Very good to talk to you. And congratulations for your book, which I've been
Thank
recommending
you.
to everyone,
Thank
and will
you.
continue to do so.
Thank you for doing the Amazon review.